Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and thanks in advance to Jennifer Kelly, who's serving as our administrator, director, and a overwhelming thank you and gratitude to Dr. Kamal Abu Shamsieh, who is here as my partner tonight. So thank you, and I first want to turn over any opening words, anything you'd like to share in the outset here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward for this dialogue to engage and to learn and to share some of our personal experiences for me living or having lived in Palestine for half of my life.
Wonderful. And would it be okay, again, we've talked about this, but you can call me Jonathan throughout. I'll call you Kamal. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. And thanks all for joining us. So just to sort of set the expectations, and thankfully Kamal and I have had a chance to speak about this in advance, that tonight is really a chance for us to listen. Tonight is about hearing one another and having a chance maybe to extend ourselves out of our bubbles from which we constantly hear the same feedback loop of the same messages, and with empathy to just give space to divergent points of view. I think that we should be rather humble in our attitude and goals for this evening. It's unlikely that world peace is going to be achieved. It's highly likely that there will be divergent opinions as we begin and divergent opinions when we come out of this. But at the very least, that perhaps there is a touch of humanity that is added to a very complex and very difficult situation. And when Kamal and I were speaking back and forth, I brought up the ethic in Judaism of B'Tselem Elohim, the idea that every human being is made equally in the image of God. That's not every Jew, that's not every Israeli, that's every living being on earth is equally holy, equally judged by God. And I think that if I could have one ethic to sort of set the table for this evening and hearing one another, that's where I would begin. I'd love to turn over and to begin by turning to Kamal. And one way I talked about framing this for this evening is just to begin by sharing really what is our own personal story that has brought us to this narrative. Where do we fit into the story? And in what way do we see ourselves as having something to say or share this very complex conflict?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. The first disagreement, I would put it theologically with you here. And as a Muslim, I don't believe we are created in the image of God. God has no image for us to look at. And it is whatever image we create in our own mind is the God idolatry that we worship. I would say comfortably, we are all born and infused with the spirit from God, the Ruh, and that God bestowed his honor on us by giving us this part of him that upon our death, that part shall return to God. And this is what makes us all dignified, regardless of where we're from, what our ancestry is, that divine element that is in each of us. We hold dear many of our scriptures in the Quran, that also what affirmed in the Torah, that is the human life is sacred. Whoever is saved one life as if he saved humanity, and whoever kills one life kills the entire race. With this, we come with that dignity of uplifting each other as both created by God. And this narrative fits well within what we try to do, is that trying to put two sides and trying to give the narratives of the two sides, and defining the two sides can sometimes be different and difficult to define. For me, I was born, and today's program is being done on the anniversary of the occupation of the West Bank. In the first week of June of 1967, that's when the West Bank was occupied. And I was born a little before that. So I lived over 2 decades of my life under Israeli military occupation. Those are the kind of stories, the narratives that shaped who I am as a young adult and shaped my interactions today with my children, having seen what my father went through trying to raise us, having seen the kind of concern that my mother would have on her face every single day as we're leaving, and all the painful memories that came with it. Today is putting a human side on what's happening. It's not an abstract, and I have to say I lived my life fairly was much better than many of my friends in Palestine, and I was not born in a refugee camp. I was born in the city of Ramallah. Yes, we lived a very modest poverty line kind of life, yet we had everything we had for the quality of life. Left Palestine in the mid-90s, immediately after the signing of Oslo, and have been in the US since then.
Wonderful. And just may I ask as a follow-up, can you speak a bit about your family there? And may I inquire, we've talked a bit about this, but I think others would like to know, to their safety, to how they are right now, your family living in Palestine and the West Bank?
My siblings, my parents passed in 2017, and my siblings remain in Ramallah. My sister married in Jerusalem, so she has been living in Jerusalem since the 80s, and she was, and her husband and sons and daughters at Al-Aqsa Mosque. She was at the Dome of the Rock with her daughters, and her husband and boys were in the Al-Aqsa Mosque when it was stormed last month. So it brought very close to the events, and we were following very concerned of what's happening in Palestine.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing it. I'm glad that overall that they're okay. Let me speak to where I come to this this issue. I do not come to speak this evening as an Israeli, obviously, but I do think that I represent sort of the quintessential American Zionist background education, both as a product of that education and as a producer of that education. Kamal, I didn't share this with you, but I actually grew up in Hawaii, very, very far away from Israel, halfway around the world. But grew up even there with a classical Zionist education. I went to religious school growing up. We celebrated Jewish holidays that were timed to coincide with agricultural calendar in Israel, learned about Israel, learned about the forefathers of Zionism as part of my religious school education. When I was 7 years old, went on our first family trip with the Jewish Federation to Israel. To be able to visit for the first time. I then attended Camp Ramah in California. Camp Ramah is a religious Zionist camp, which includes Zionism as part of its curriculum, and Hebrew as part of its curriculum. The summer after 10th grade, I went with the rest of Ramah camps on a week journey all around Israel. It's really one of the highlights of my life. I grew an attachment from that period that allowed me in college to then study abroad my junior year at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and to spend much of that time exploring the land, hiking, camping, everywhere that I could find, growing an affinity. Returned to Israel multiple times, and then for me, honestly, when it came to considering rabbinical school, one of the benefits, one of the highlights of deciding to become a rabbi was knowing I would have a reason to go back to live in Israel to study. To move back to Israel at that time, this was the height of the Second Intifada, in which rabbinical students were given a choice whether they could remain safe and study that first year stateside and return when things had subsided, or they could study in Israel. And I made the decision that if I'm going to be a leader within the people of Israel, that I need to stand and be there with Israel, not just only in good times, but in very tough times, and had a very challenging year, one in which I met my now wife, who's Israeli, and have extended family through her throughout Israel. And since then, I have continued to return to Israel and to lead multiple trips through multiple congregations in bringing American Jewish families to get to know more about Israel, both within the borders of what we call Israel proper, or we can talk about terminology around this, and having spent time within the West Bank. I have not spent time in Gaza, and we can discuss why. We're talking about narratives here, so the narrative I will share is that I would not personally feel safe, and the Israeli government would not feel safe with me entering into Gaza. That's actually something that's forbidden. And so I come to all of this amidst a real change, and that's where I wanted to start here with you, if that's okay. We wanted to talk about this latest round of violence in Israel, and what's really, how is our community, what's been taken from this? And one of the real changes, I think that within the American Jewish community, there is a sense that this latest round of violence was different than those in the past. And that's, I think, different in twofold. One, here in America or throughout the world, and one in Israel. I'll start within Israel. Within Israel, the really scary thing was to see the rising of Arab Israelis within towns throughout Israel, rising up, sometimes violently. Jews sometimes rising up violently. There were mobs on both sides. And to see that sort of unrest and violence in the streets of towns in which I had always thought of pluralism as being one of the real backbones, that was very upsetting, I know, to many of my Israeli contacts as well, and to me. And second, there's a palpable shift in the perception, especially by young Jewish Americans, who increasingly see the actions of the Israeli government unfavorably, increasingly are connecting their own passions around social justice in America to perceived injustice against Palestinians, and are having a harder time reconciling their Jewish identity with that of a Zionist. And it's something that I, as a rabbi, need to listen to carefully, because there is something changing. The ground is moving beneath us, and that shift behooves us to listen to our youth and to understand where they're coming from. So that's my takeaway from this. I'd love to hear yours.
Absolutely. Few things did not change. Number one is the media coverage. The traditional media coverage did not change. Continued to be one-sided. As a matter of fact, the so-called mainstream media decided to cover the conflict only when Hamas started sending their projectiles into Israel. However, the conflict has been raging before that. The storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque happened before that. Land confiscation happened before that, or did not stop. So that's one element of it. The second one is how the news media is being, how the story is being told, how the narratives are being told in the media did not change. You have Israelis killed and Palestinians died. How they will report, as if the Palestinians will die out of natural causes. Civilian populations in Israel being targeted and Hamas targets in Gaza. So that has been an ongoing problem that is not just limited to this current cycle of violence. What changed, however, is, and also I would say the brutality of the Israeli government did not change. That's what I expect of an occupation, has been doing that from day one, or even before the creation of Israel, is this policy against the Palestinians. What changed, however, is we are no longer people of the world depending on news media to receive our information. We receive our information firsthand on our iPhones through people who see that as first witness account, and the news media and politicians are being forced to respond to what has been before is a systematic policy of not covering what's going on. So basically the misinformation and the disinformation is being challenged today. So that's one of the things that changed in the current cycle. The second one, I've spoken with one of my neighbors who moved and lived now in the city of Lod. And for the first time, they have lived the fears of the 1947, 1948 mobs coming, Israeli Jewish mobs, because my friend is Israeli Arab, so I put the word Jewish just to distinguish, coming into their homes, shooting at them, and in the protection of the Israeli police. He said, all what we can do, we cannot be remaining silent. We have to do something. If we go up on our roofs, we would be shot at by the Israeli police. So basically we were shouting, throwing whatever we can do within our own hands, from furniture, blocking the doors. So the violence that happened within the citizens of Israel, who are Arabs and Israelis, in a way expose the fallacies of the so-called coexistence while inequality. If Arabs were in Israel were equal to the Jewish citizens of Israel, equal in the sense of their treatment, if they were not treated as second-hand citizens, they will be upset by what's happening at Al-Aqsa and Gaza. They will not remove Israeli flags of their cities and host the Palestinian flags instead. So the Zionist project in that sense failed to remove the national identity of the Palestinians who are living in now what is called Israel from their memory, even after 70 years of occupation.
Thank you. I want to start with something. We can agree on a statement 100%, and then if we talked further, we'd realize that disagree. That if you said to me that one of the things you've noticed is the unfair reporting of the media, the biased reporting of the media, the faulty reporting of the media, that I think that I would represent my Zionist American perspective very well, my narrative very well by saying, oh yes, it's very biased. And you and I would say mean it in the exact opposite ways. And it's fascinating to me that, again, within our own worlds, that there are deeply divergent opinions on this. And there are times in the past where I have canceled my subscription to the New York Times over being upset over how I felt Israel was being treated unfairly. I felt that there was double standards that were being applied. And that it's fascinating that you would feel very similarly about media in the polar opposite direction. And that just shows really where we are. And so I appreciate that. I appreciate your saying about what was going on with the Arab Israeli population. And I wanna again speak to another commonality here for a moment. I think I'm gonna say something here that you would agree with, I'm guessing wholeheartedly. That is that as of this moment, that there is in Israel, that there's a real danger this week. And that is that there are elements within Israeli society who are hoping to revive the National Flag Day, which is a nationalist expression around the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967, in which activists, nationalists parade through the Muslim quarter of the old city, and many of them call out to the Arab Israelis and Palestinians that they will one day live here and they will evacuate them from this area. There is overt racism that occurs as a part of this day, and it is being revived specifically, I would say, by the Netanyahu government in the hope of breaking up the coalition, which looks is coming together. It is not so coincidentally timed to the fact that by the end of this week, hopefully the coalition will be confirmed by the Knesset. And if enough friction can be caused by this in the next couple of days, then perhaps Netanyahu has a chance of breaking up this unity government, which includes for the first time an Arab Israeli party. I think it is a deeply cynical, I think it is a shameful process. And already the police have refused to run this parade through Damascus Gate and through the Arab quarter, but through the Muslim quarter. But there is open conversations as we speak, trying to override the warning from the police. And I openly pray that not be allowed to happen, because it is clearly aimed towards creating strife and friction between Jews and Muslims living in Jerusalem, which is the last thing that we need right now. Anything that you would, before you go, anything you want to say in response to that?
You're absolutely right. The tension is rising. What I would point out to is this tension is not new. It's not, I will not just put the blame on Netanyahu and his attempts to remain in power for inciting on extreme right wing to come to Jerusalem. They have been coming every single year under both governments, whether be it the right wing of the Likud or the Labor that has been dominating Israel politics since the creation of Israel. So this event is intentional. It's a provocative event that is sponsored by the government. The only difference is happening today after a round of violence that happened. So there is nothing more unique in terms of adding to that element. It is an element that been viewed by the Palestinians as always an event that is creating supremacy, provocation, and that basically is what to the youth of Jerusalem who finally said, enough is enough. We're not going to put up with that. And that what has been happening is Palestinians who are residents of Jerusalem, who've been born there, seeing their homes being taken away from them, for settlers who are coming from New York or other places to take over under government programs, and finally said, no, this kind of ethnic cleansing needs to stop. The second difference that is happening with that is it's no longer a Palestinian issue, really. Today, there is a link between, and that's the change that happened since the murder of George Floyd a year ago, is the policy, which the training of the police in the US using the Israeli tactics, so that's been used to against the Palestinians, and the direct casualty of it was George Floyd, was killed by a tactic that Israeli soldiers use against the Palestinians. Black Lives Matter saw that and linked that with as a war against oppression and racism. So that's for the first time what's happening in Palestine is being widened so widely to be placed in the framework that this is not between two people or two religions. This is a global fight against oppression and against colonialism and racism for that matter.
That was a lot. We should talk about a lot of the terms that came up there. And you and I talked about wanting to go over terminology, because I also have a feeling that sometimes when we say certain things and when others hear it, that two different things are meant. And there, we've brought up, I think I heard the word ethnic cleansing, we heard the word colonialism, in that I think there's also the idea of intersectionality and connecting Black Lives Matter and what happened to George Floyd to Zionism, to Israeli police tactics. There is a lot there to unpack. So let's take it bit by bit, if that's okay with you. I'd love to let's just start at the outset about, let's name our terms when it comes to Zionism. So I am proudly a Zionist. What I mean by a Zionist is I believe that the Jewish people, just like every other people in the world, have a right to self-determination within their own ancestral homeland. I believe that everyone should have that. That's, again, we've discussed, I believe that the Palestinians have no less of a right to the exact same thing. As a Zionist, it causes me at times to, when I hear criticism of Israel, and when I feel as though it is unequal, or as though Israel is being singled out for errors that other countries make brazenly all of the time, that Israel is picked on. And as an American Zionist, and I say even more so as a Jew, it plays upon my own historical insecurities and sensitivity that Jews need protection and need a refuge, that when anti-Semitism, and I'm not saying that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, I'm not going to go there, just there. We should unpack all of that as well. But that for some reason, the Jewish dream of a national home is treated differently than others. And that's problematic, and that causes all sorts of emotional reactions. That is my explanation of Zionism. I'd love to hear from you, like, what does Zionism mean to you?
Before the creation of Zionism, we look at Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and Jews who lived in the land and have connection to the land. And that experience, was disrupted throughout history. The Crusades disrupt that. There were violence between Muslims and Jews way before the creation of Israel, and that's basically, I don't want to call it normal, but it happens in communities. What's happened with the Zionist movement is, here is the use of Judaism as a religion to establish a foothold in Palestine. Zionist has no room in Palestine. There is no link to Zionism in Palestine. Jews have claims to Palestine as people who live there, same as Muslims who live there, and they have holy sites, and that is not to be conflated. The two terms are not the same. Zionism and Judaism are not the same. That's the way I look at it. The second one is the impact of Zionist movement versus the impact of the presence of Jews in Palestine is not the same. Jews who are Palestinians lived with, and there is a pocket of Jewish community, Sumerians, living in the foothill of Nablus today, and they are shopping in Palestine, in Nablus, and living close by, has not been impacted. Probably they did not adopt the Zionist ideology. The Zionist ideology impacted the Palestinians firsthand, because for the first time, it is the Zionist movement that said, this is our land, and this is applied that in a policy that kicked the Palestinians out of their homes to make room for people who were persecuted in Europe or other places, but the Palestinians have no, basically what was happening in Europe, we saw as became a victim of it as well, which is Palestinians were kicked out of their home. So our narrative of how you see Zionism and how you see it are completely different. But today is not about Zionism. Today is about a story between two people. One, a system of occupation, occupying the Palestinians, and one people who are occupied. And that's where the root cause of the problem. So I don't see, yes, Zionism, in the way I look at it, will fuel the conflict and shape it, because it drives certain narratives to secure two things. Either will be within the safety or the supremacy of Israel. So it's between these two. The Zionist movement has no goodwill toward the Palestinians to say otherwise there will be something about the Palestinians who lost their homes, lost their lands, were kicked out, and been living as refugees for over 70 years.
You know, it's interesting. I see Zionism as a form of restorative justice, and you see Zionism as being a problem which requires restorative justice. If that's fair to say.
I see Zionism as a racist movement that basically brought the root cause of the problem today in Palestine. I don't see any liberation in it. I see systematic policies that, as in the words of Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, he said, what's happening in Palestine today is even worse than apartheid South Africa. That has not been before the creation of the State of Israel or the ongoing treatment of the Palestinians.
So, again, a lot to unpack, and but I want to be first of all, thank you for sharing that. Like that I have to say, like, as a Zionist, to hear someone speak about Zionism from a point of not just critique, but of frustration, pain is hard. It's hard for me to hear. Because
Jonathan, let me interrupt you for a second, if I may. Those who were victims of the Holocaust, whether be it in Germany, whether be it in Poland, or in all the countries around there, if Zionism is truly a restorative-based movement, the people who were attacked and the victims of the Holocaust will have restorative justice in the countries where they lived. They will not be coming to Palestine to completely change the demographic and the harmony and the makeup of the Palestine to make room for people who are victims. So it's not restorative justice, it's colonialist.
So a lot of terms there. So let me, and again, thank you for sharing it. And I'm really, how do we do this in a way that doesn't become sort of a he said, and I'm not trying to score points. I'm trying to explain again from, I'll just give my Zionist narrative in this, and I don't mean for what I say to negate your truth. Does that make sense? Like I think we're just here trying to share stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the first thing I would say is that we have to keep in mind that the majority of Jews living in Israel are not of European descent. It's something I think that's often a mistake made by American Jews, that because the majority of American Jews present as white, that we think of the same thing. Only about 44% of, somewhere between there, of Israeli Jews are present as white. The majority of them come actually from North Africa and from the East, from Middle East. And 900,000 of those in the Middle East were expelled from their countries, many of them after the advent of Israel. And it's hard because when we use the word ethnically cleanse, I think of the ethnic cleanse means the removal of one group of people, usually to make space for others. And so I would think that we would be able to apply the exact same term of ethnic cleansing to what happened to the Jews of Yemen, Morocco, Iran, so forth, that were Israel not to exist, they would have nowhere to go. That one of the key ideas of Zionism is that even for those who don't live in Israel, Zionism changed the life of every Jew in the world because it solved the problem, the 2,000-year-old problem of Jewish homelessness. That for 2,000 years, wherever a Jew lived, the leader of that nation or of that feudal kingdom, wherever it was, had complete power because they knew that if the Jew did not do what they wanted them to do, that they could be expelled and there would be nowhere for them to go. And that Israel solves that problem for the first time by saying, we will take you. And especially after much of the Western world closed its borders in the early 20th century, that there was no other country that was willing to take Jews other than Israel. And so when we talk about a restorative justice, I see it as solving a problem that led to the persecution of Jews without any recompense for that time period. Now, I'm going to go into one other thing that you said as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. When part of the Zionist narrative is that it's not as though Palestine was a settled state in 1900, that the demographics seem to show that there was roughly 250,000 people who living in today's Israel at that time, much of them nomadic, much of them working in different parts of the land, real remnants of the Ottoman Empire. And often one thing is cited is Mark Twain's journal of his travels to the land and finding the land being a very harsh place to live. And that Jews coming to that land, they're actually, I don't know if you know this, there were debates within early Zionism, and there were different ideas about what Israel would look like. There were some Zionists who were completely ignorant or did not want to acknowledge the fact that other people lived there already. That is accurate. You are right to say that there were some that just completely overlooked or chose not to see that there were people living in the land. There were others who I would say from a condescending perspective said, oh, the people there will like it when there are more Jews because we'll make life better for them. That happened too. There were others who said, let's go there and make one nation with the same people with both the Jews who've been living there all this time and the Arabs who've been living there all that time. And ultimately, the idea became to share the land. I'm guessing from you that that's not a narrative that you would share. I'd love to hear your response to that.
The issue of sharing, Jonathan, if once again, I don't think the Palestinians were on the mind of the Zionist movement, not then, not now. There were Jews who lived, you're right, who lived in Palestine, and Jews who lived in Arab countries, the Sephardics, as you referred to, the Mizrahi who came from the east, they lived. And they are discriminated, by the way. They are still, when you look at the European Jews, they are the superior race, and the other people who lived under the poverty line did not receive the same. So there is discrimination even against Eastern Jewish people. So it's not a matter of rescue. They were used for a systematic approach. Is you bring in people, and I'm not going to go into conspiracy theory. How did the people leave the countries where they lived? As a matter of fact, they left. They left Iraq, they left Yemen, they left Syria, they left Morocco, and they came to Palestine. In order to make room for them, the Palestinians have to be kicked out. And that's what I meant by ethnic cleansing. It's not a matter of sharing the land. If it's a matter of sharing the land, why would still be today refugees scattered around Palestine? And the first item on the negotiations was the right of return of the people who kicked out of their home, and Israel would say no. So there is no concept of sharing the land. There is concept of promoting ideas that let's make the desert bloom. This is a country was empty, there is no people. No, Palestine had a civilization and has a culture and has a people who lived, probably the majority of them were farmers. At the same time, we cannot look at the history of Palestine without looking at the history of those who occupied Palestine. So when we say there was no country called Palestine, because Palestine has been always occupied, as there was no country called Israel to begin with. So having nothing being established before does not mean there are no people, indigenous people living on the land. Palestine was occupied by the Turks, by the Ottoman Empire, I would say, for more than 400 years, was under British mandate, and that's how the British today is equally guilty in the creation of the Palestinian catastrophe by allowing the illegal immigration and the settling of Zionists into Palestine on the expense of people, and leaving without making a solution for that problem. The West Bank was occupied administratively by Jordan. Egypt was controlling Gaza. So Palestine has always been under foreign rule. The only difference between all of those who came in, including the Crusades, all of those who came in to occupy the land, none of them claimed that this is theirs and the inhabitants have the right in it, except the current problem that happened 70 years ago, that Palestinians rightly refer to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe, which is the creation of Israel. So that's from a historical point. But I'm hoping that we can move beyond the historical point to see what's the impact of it on daily life of people. And by the way, the creation of Israel does not make it safer for Jews in Israel. Occupying other people did not result in safety and security for the Israelis. One person might say they're even worse off today than they were in Arab countries living as citizens of that country. So occupying people by force does not result in safety. The problem is the occupation. And if the two people to really share the life, and they should share the country, is to find a solution that is based on equality, equity, and justice. It cannot be an occupier and an occupied.
Thank you, and I really appreciate what you share there. I want to ask you about the word occupation for a moment, because it's one of those terms that we come back to. First of all, I understand that some American Jews, there are some who would object to even the word occupation. How can you occupy something that is your own? And if you looked at the indigenous claim of Jews to Judea Samaria, how can you call that occupied? I actually really like the idea that my teacher Michael Goodman here. I have several books of while we're suggesting. I know this the Catch 67, which is about the 67 war and its outcome. He talks about the fact that you can dispute whether or not the land is occupied. You cannot dispute whether the people living there are occupied. So long as you have people who are not able to define their own borders, are not able to fully choose their own government, are not able to fully decide where they can go and at what times, that the word occupation can and should be used, and that frankly this term is less controversial in Israel than it is in America. I mentioned to you that no less of a liberal than Ariel Sharon openly used the word occupation. So we're going to use the word occupation. I think that's something that as American Jews we should come to terms with the word occupation and understand that I don't see how you could use any word but that to describe the situation. And that's exactly where Israeli politicians across the spectrum are. It occurs to me, however, that when I say occupation, I think of 1967. But I think when you say occupation, I think you're talking about 1947. And I wanted to hear that out, because that's something that's new and interesting to me. Can you discuss that, please?
Yes. Describing occupation cannot be from an Israeli narrative, whether Israelis or American Jews would accept that or not. We live in a global village, as they say it. Israel was not created because Jews came and occupied Palestine. Israel was created because the United Nations acknowledged Israel and gave it the legitimacy. So in one hand, the acceptance of United Nations resolutions and Security Council resolutions whenever it fits the interests of the occupier, and reject them whenever does not work. You have today over 140 countries recognize the area that is Palestine today as occupied. We can disagree on what the borders of where it was occupied. I look at it as historical Palestine is occupied today, and that is occupied by Israel. One taken as its own to create the state of Israel, and the second one is a colonialist project to bring in settlers to move in and to subject the local population to all kinds of treatments without rights. So that's where the two entities are different, yet both of them are occupied by Israel. So I look at international law as the one that defines what's happening. I look at the United Nations Security Council resolutions that were the platform. Whether I agree with the negotiations or not, that's something different, but that's the two parties they agreed to, that is based on United Nations resolutions. So it is occupied. So in other words, psychologically speaking, it will be much better to look at it from that sense, rather to look at it as, oh, it's my home, I came back to it. We look at reality on the ground. And today, when I look at Palestine also, I look at reality on the ground. Historical Palestine is no longer historical Palestine, it is occupied. And what is left out of it to be traded or to establish a state for the Palestinians is no longer viable, because of the ongoing land confiscation and moving in settlers into the West Bank. So perspectives change because of changes on the ground.
That's great. It's funny, I think just like with the media, we would probably agree in the statement that the UN is a frustrating and I don't know, just a dismaying institution, and we would often probably speak to it from very opposite perspectives in that. There's no institution that I think American Zionists dislike more than the UN, and find, if you just look at which members are allowed to sit on things like the Security Council, or on the various different committees, it it's, let's just put it this way, it's a common straw man for American Jews to attack. But I want to go back to what you were saying about occupation. So, because we are talking about, like, where do we see this going from here? Let me ask you, is there, if occupation is what occurred not in 67 but in 47, then is there for you any just resolution to the conflict other than Jews being removed from the state? What in your eyes is what is, I'd love to know what does justice mean for you in this situation?
I haven't heard any Palestinian calling for Jews to be removed from Palestine. So if this is something that is being promoted, I would like to see the source for something like that. I don't think Palestinians called for that. What happened is Palestinians were removed from Palestine to make room for settlers. When people are calling on Palestinians to accept and to recognize the state of Israel, I look at, yes, they accepted that in 1993. But when is Israelis and American Jews will accept the same for the Palestinians?
It's fascinating.
I have yet to see that.
Again. So let me.
In other words, it is the right of the Palestinians that needs to be preserved. It is the safety of the Palestinians that needs to be preserved. It is Israel that is a threat to the Palestinians, not the other way around. So those are the narratives that most people don't see. Palestine and Palestinians are not an existential threat to Israelis. It's the other way around.
What would you say to, if you're saying that Palestinians show you the source of someone who are advocating for the removal of Jews from the land, how does Hamas charter not say exactly that? What's the difference?
I would call for the removal of all Israeli settlers from the West Bank and Gaza and around, from all the areas that were occupied in 1967. Having called for their removal does not mean the same statement as people say, kick all the Jews out of the land. That's not the same.
But Hamas doesn't say to go back to 67.
I'm not a spokesperson for Hamas.
And I just say
no, Jonathan,
fair enough.
And the conflict is not between Israel and Hamas, because that is literally disrespectful for every Palestinian to reduce the conflict as a conflict between Hamas and Israel. And there is some among us Palestinians who say Israel created Hamas in its drive to weaken the national Palestinian movement in the 70s, allowed the Islamic movement to flourish, to organize, to build an infrastructure, while going after labor unions and activists and mayors who were democratically elected in 1976. So that's the issue, is not Hamas versus Israel.
I appreciate, and I in no way mean to imply that Hamas speaks for Palestinians. I think that very often people allow Hamas to be the boogeyman, that then they're able to justify any treatment of Palestinians based upon that. And I'm not trying to do that anyway. I'm just trying to respond to the idea of whether there are any voices that advocate for the removal of Jews, because I would say that from the Zionist perspective, that is how it often lands upon, I'll say for me. So let me ask you this. Part of, I think, the core Zionist narrative, and I keep coming back to this again and again, these are sort of all of the ideas, I'm sharing with you, and you know this all very well, these are the things that when I talk to fellow Zionists, these are things we talk about. right? This is not a secret conversation here. And part of the core story that we tell is that at multiple points along the way, Jews have made conscientious and gut-wrenching compromise offers to share the land, and that they have felt rejected by that. That the chief example is first, is of course with 1947, the partition, but and again, this is when I was really starting to live in Israel and to understand that you probably, you will know this well, but maybe some who others are watching this maybe are less aware. I want us to be conscious for a moment of how much the failure of Oslo, and then following the assassination of Rabin, someone who gave their life trying to create peace between the two peoples, and the offers then, subsequent offers, and culminating in Olmert's offer, and how those, each of them were rejected with, and again, this is the story that I tell, so feel free to push back, that each one of these were rejected without any counter offer. That when you ask where is the left-wing party in Israel today, I would say the left-wing party was destroyed in Oslo. And there were millions of Israelis who wanted desperately peace, but shrugged their shoulders and said, that's the best that we can ever do. And I guess there's no partner for us. I'm sure you've heard all of this rationale before. I'd love to just, because it's so despondent. I tell you, it's so depressing. Like, this was, like, when I speak about these things, you can tell I get emotional. I cry thinking of Rabbi and the aftermath, and it was just such a gut-wrenching moment. And I just, how was that perceived by you? I know you can't speak for all of your community, but just for you at least, where does that narrative connect and disconnect?
No, number one, you started by saying Labour and Likud, the Israeli left or right, maybe are different when it comes to Israeli politics, but still they are the same coin when it comes to treatment of the Palestinians. Rabin was guilty of taking more land of the Palestinians to build for settlements, the Labour, in the early 80s and the 90s more than anybody else. So I don't think this is a good premise to look upon people as if we forget the impact of what they did for 40 some years. All these offers that you mentioned, Jonathan, which I'm very well aware of what they were, don't amount to what we look at as a threshold for justice. What would be the threshold for justice is the right of return for Palestinians who were kicked out of their homes to come back to their homes, or to accept to receive compensation. And that's what you started with by describing Zionism as restorative justice. Where is restorative justice for the Palestinians? Any agreement that will fall short of that, no Palestinian will accept. Otherwise, will be a proxy Palestinian government that maintains the caretaker for the occupation, and that's what the Palestinian Authority is all about today, being reduced to a caretaker of the occupation, because Israel is interested in the land, not interested in the people. So they gave the autonomy to run the affairs of the people to the Palestinian Authority, while continue to control in the agreement itself. That's why it failed. When Palestinians have no control over their own resources, including water, have no control over movement. So all these are temporary measures or reshuffling of the occupation, but the occupation remains. For me, when I was born, I was assigned a 9-digit number. When I did an ethics fellowship, and here it's not a comparison, I'm not comparing. I did an ethics fellowship at Auschwitz, and I met with a survivor who showed me a tattoo on her arms that was put by the Nazis. It triggered to me a memory, which I shared with her. I said, you know what, when I was born, I was given a 9-digit number issued by the Israeli military. And I only know it when I recited in Hebrew. automatically I cannot remember it in Arabic or any other language. I need to write it down. As someone who was growing up, was looking forward to being 16, 16 here, sweet 16 over there, is to be able to go to the movies without a chaperone for the first time. But also 16 under military Israeli law means that you must apply for an ID card. You're no longer a kid. So you need to carry that. And you need to remember a 9-digit number that you must recite that number upon request by any Israeli military or an Israeli soldier. And I carried that in my life, in my mind, for 27 years I lived there. Then Oslo took place, and all of a sudden we were asked to replace the ID cards that were issued by the Israeli army into an ID card issued by the Palestinian Authority, and on the outside is the state of Palestine, which I did. But when I open it from inside, it's the same number. When I applied to an Palestinian passport, it's the same 9-digit number. So when I say nothing literally working, because it is an immortal occupation that is creating hatred for the politics or for the impact of its policies on the generations to come. So it is not a matter of X percentage of land. As long as the people are treated subhuman, they will react in an inhumane way. So that is the core of the conflict. The Palestinians deserve dignity, deserve peace, security, opportunity, like any other people of the world, including Israelis. When I say Palestinians, I don't say I take out that right of an Israeli to live, but I'm saying that right is being taken away, ongoing, from the Palestinians. And when we talk about two sides, I don't see the two sides equally. Maybe the current cycle of violence disrupted life for the Israelis for 10 days, but life has been disrupted for the Palestinians for 70 years, or look at it, for 54 years for those in the West Bank. So it's not a matter of two sides. One is living as citizen of a country, and one is living as an occupied with no rights whatsoever.
First of all, thank you for sharing the story. And that sounds, I can't imagine what that must be like to see that number. And I'm so sorry for that. And I just, if I just want to communicate my empathy for you on that, like I hear you on that one. The idea of Palestinian return is really, I think, the unspoken of crux issue. And I think it's something that most American Jews don't fully understand or know about. And I think that it was a reason why that was left to be the last issue resolved in Oslo, because it was the one that was the most intractable. I'm going to hold up one other book here that this came out last year. I don't know if you've seen The War of Return by Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, but really goes over the entire history of the law of return. And you and I could spend a 2-hour session just on the idea of return and how that's perceived by both sides. So I'm going to try to not go in that direction just now, if that's okay, because I think we could get lost in it. I think that what I'd love to hear from you then is, it seems like the way that we're both describing this is that there is a bit of a chicken and the egg issue here, that I think I would say from the Israelis that I speak to, there is an earnest desire to make the life of Palestinians better, but they don't know how to do that without making themselves vulnerable and their own security at risk. How do I, if people are shooting rockets at me, how do I give them more freedom without making myself more open attack? So how do you build trust in that situation? I don't know where to go with that.
If we have not really settled the issue of whether Palestine is occupied or not, and here we're far removed from daily life over there, how can you build trust with people occupied with their occupiers? the first thing comes down to power. You cannot clinch to power and look at people who will be establishing trust. You cannot look at the dehumanization of people and look at people to establish trust. You cannot block international investigation of war crimes and think that people say, oh, we are just defending ourselves. So all these things require paradigm shift and calls. Is Israel accountable, or is it a country that is above the law, that is being given the blank check, political cover by our government here, and fueled by extreme Christian nuts who will think about bringing about the Messiah, so you will be killed if you don't convert. And that strange bedfellows brings power to the government of Israel. We have to address the root cause of what's going on. It's not the Palestinian who's trying to go to cultivate his land and to live off his olive orchard that is the root cause of the problem. And then look upon him, say, what can I do for you so you will trust me? I don't trust you for what you have been doing. Is this systematic racist occupation got to stop? It went on for too long. So that's when trust will be built. The second one, restorative justice for those who left. You cannot occupy the country and say, people here, they just left by themselves. No, they did not leave by themselves. There was an ethnic cleansing of Palestine. They were forced, driven out of their homes. And after their homes were destroyed, their villages were destroyed. And the names of their villages were changed to Hebrew names. If it's not ethnic cleansing, I don't know what's that. So the people who were driven out of their homes should be given. It is the moral responsibility, the apology, that the creation of the state of Israel resulted in the refugee problem. That should be part of the psyche of American Jews and Israelis. Whether intended or not, that is the moral responsibility, is to acknowledge that the creation of Israel resulted in a catastrophe on the Palestinian natives who fled their homes or driven to flee out of their homes. Then once the acknowledgement is there, is what can we do to solve it? There's some say, oh, I'm happy where I am. I don't want to go back. Some people might say, no, I want to come to the US. It's an international issue. It's not an issue left alone to the goodwill of an occupier to solve. It is an international issue because Israel's occupation is being maintained internationally. So when we look at this problem, it is an American problem as well as an Israeli problem. What to do with the people who were driven out of their homes, the millions and their descendants who are still awaiting justice for 70 years. Compensation, resettlement, come back to live in their own homes, come back to live in the West Bank. Those are all require creative solutions, but I'm still looking at the principle. If they are not being given the right to return, I don't think we will be able to establish peace.
I sidestepped around the right of return issue, and you went right back to it. So I'm happy to speak to that if you wish. Let me just so let me ask you this: in your estimation, then, I think what I'm hearing from you is that justice, the ideal compromise, would be for there to be two states among 67 borders, I'm assuming with a capital in East Jerusalem, and on top of that, that anyone who lived in Israel proper pre-47 be able to return to their home. Is that a fair, is that what I'm hearing?
I did not say any of that, Jonathan.
Okay, good, then correct me.
No, all what I said is, number one, to start the beginning of solution, you undo the injustice, undo the apparatus of the injustice, which is occupation. The two parts has to be separated. Palestinians deserve international protection, not protection from Israel. So protection for the Palestinians, the land and how they can, the land can be shared, I'll leave it for the negotiations, because they're not going, whether Hamas call for kicking out all the Jews out of Palestine, or whether the current, the incoming prime minister, who's a prime minister of a transfer, asking for transferring all people of Palestine. We have all kind of crazy people from all directions. The idea becomes all of them will fail. And it's a matter of people like you and I will say, enough with the madness. You're not going to kick the people out. Better think of other ways that are creative solutions. And you're right, we cannot live with that ongoing because it's not sustainable for any of the people there. Whether Palestine is one country, I mean one state, whether be it two states, whether be it three states, to me makes no difference. What makes a difference is people, their rights are being restored. They have the freedom to earn a living without fear. Those are the kind of things that we have. And it requires a lot of compromise. Already Palestinians compromised a lot from what is called historical Palestine. Accepting the state of Israel by the state by itself is a compromise. So I agree with you that compromises needs to be there, and however, it's not up to the, when it comes to the issue of justice, to say, well, let the Arab countries observe those who fled and they have no rights. No, that is a red line. And yes, so you'll find every Palestinian coming back to it. Without the right of return, there will be no peace in the Middle East.
Right. I think, again, I think that we come back to that's going to be so let me just, I'll speak to you just a bit because others probably want to hear the Jewish perspective as what it would be with or at least with the Zionist perspective when it comes to the right of return. So the first idea, and I hope, I don't mean this to be like, again, like I'm going to say this, I'm trying not to be confrontational here, and I don't want to, we're not trying to win the argument here. I'm trying to express sort of the viewpoint here and seeking out, like, I think we're like blind people seeking out areas of commonality, common ground where we can start. The right of return, I think the first thing is that as a Zionist, I would question whether this is indeed a right under international law, that there have been multiple conflicts, many conflicts in which there have been the movement of people. And I would say that during 1947, there was ethnic cleansing on both sides. There were towns, there is a Zionist narrative that says that the IDF does nothing wrong. This is all great. No, there was clearly ethnic cleansing on the behalf of the Israeli government, the army in 1947. It is well documented. Here, another great book, Ari Shavit's My Promised Land, has an entire chapter on it. You can read about it. This is, for those from coming from the Zionist perspective, this is not new news. This is not controversial to say that there was ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their land. That is 100% historically, that's a fact. I don't know how you can argue against it. And that the issue is that in all other conflicts, whether it be, in some examples might be between North Korea, South Korea, East Germany, West Germany, that there was no right by the people displaced to then be resettled into the space where as a minority into this new majority land. And that to do so would be to render Israel as a Jewish homeland and as a place of Jewish self-determination as impossible, because at that point you no longer have a Jewish majority, which means you have to choose between democracy and Judaism, which is something that Zionism has refused to do. The basic idea of David Ben-Gurion is that you can't have all the land and all the democracy and all the Jewish sovereignty. You have to give something up. And that the land, it has to be minimized in order to allow for the sovereignty of the Palestinian. So the issue when it comes up is if we incorporate this idea of return, it means that there is one Palestinian state in today's West and Gaza, and then there is another state which is not a Jewish state, in which there is potentially a Muslim Palestinian majority, and there is no longer space for Jewish self-determination. So how do we fix that? And is that something that do you think that we as Jews should be willing to sacrifice and just live in a multinational state and take that as it is?
I leave that up to the Israelis, the Zionists, whatever you are, to settle what kind of entity Israel will be. What will be, if you consider it democratic, secular, Zionist, Jewish, that's an internal issue. That is not of an interest to any Palestinian, what you call it. What will be an interest to every Palestinian, not just every Palestinian, every citizen, person of the world, is Israel above the law? Is this a country that adheres to international law or not? If not, will be a rouge state. How is that going to be different than North Korea? How is that going to be different than Iran or any other country that says we're above the law? You have Security Council resolutions. You have United Nations resolution. The United Nations, I believe it's called 194, that is guaranteeing the right of the refugees Palestinians to return back to their land. So on one hand, international law is being accepted to come to impose sanctions on countries, yet when it comes to Israel, say, no, we don't recognize that. United Nations is anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. I don't think that will continue to work for the future. I think the problem with the occupation that it went on for too long. And it's time to end it. It's time to end it actually for the sake of the Israelis before then the sake of the Palestinians. It's for the sake of the future generation that for the sake of world peace needs to be ended. Palestine, and in particular, the land that was occupied 54 years ago is considered an occupied territories that is occupied by Israel under international law. The Fourth Geneva Convention that dictates how the treatment of those who are occupied by the occupier apply, whether the government of Israel decides to recognize that or not. That's what kept the Palestinian issue alive for 54 years, is those international agreements. Otherwise, there could be a genocide or could be killing of mass people and no one would hear about, like many other places that happen. No, the international law applies to the occupation. Whether you call it occupied or not, literally is not of any interest to the Palestinians or to the people who live there or to the people of the world. There is a rule of law that we live by it. Is it going to be just for every people all the time? We don't live in utopia. No, and that's why we say it will be painful and requires compromise to settle the issue over there. The most important part is how you and I will live our lives here in the US. Because to me, the conflict does impact us in different ways. And we are connected to the land and to the people in different ways. And I won't say one is more than the other. I said, we're just impacted. But we don't control the conflict, and yet it's impacting our lives here. And when you see the rise of Islamophobia, and when you see the rise of anti-Semitism, we have a responsibility jointly to come in and to look at the root causes of these. Here we're debating and we might agree. It's not a point of scoring points, Jonathan, because otherwise it would be a cheap way to look at the conflict. I'm looking at lives that are being shed in vain. The children are being killed and murdered. This is not about securing a point over you and I. Otherwise, I won't consider you as a friend and won't talk to you. Say, no, we're here needs to have some moral responsibility to look at what's happening today and how we can move forward and how it's impact our lives today. How can we move away the concept of restorative justice, deny it to the Palestinians, while you march for Black Lives Matters and say we need to have accountability? Well, today we need to have accountability for the state of Israel in its treatment of the Palestinians. It's no longer can live and act in impunity without any checks or balances. If there is an international court that is investigating hate crimes, should be given free access to investigate. If there are claims that the Palestinians committed war crimes, let them be investigated. And the same thing, if Israel committed war crimes, let that be investigated by an independent body. I don't trust the Israeli army to investigate its own soldiers the way I don't trust the US police to investigate its own policemen. Anytime you give any entity, be it a government or a group, the power unchecked, there'll be abuse.
I'm going to go. We're I think reaching towards. I think we're trying to end this for 90 minutes. I'm gonna go from very seriousness to ridiculousness for a moment here. There's a movie about 15 years ago. I don't know if you saw this ridiculous Adam Sandler movie called "Don't Mess with the Zohan," which is a comedy about an IDF soldier who comes to the U.S. Have you seen this movie? I will just tell you, my wife and I saw this in San Francisco. We were the only ones laughing throughout because we were the only ones that got all of the jokes making fun of Israeli sort of macho culture. But the thesis of the movie, when you really get down to it, is that there is terrible conflict in the Middle East, but when Jews and Muslims come to the US, they don't have to bring that baggage with them and they can get along, and that it's different here. And I was thinking about that movie because I think it speaks to a moment, and I'm afraid that I feel as though that moment has passed. And I feel as though, just as you're saying, that there are terrible attacks on Muslim, on Arab Americans, just as there is a raging spike in anti-Semitism. There's at this moment, I am missing a rally going on in Scarsdale about the spike in anti-Semitism and Jews being attacked, and yes, many times at anti-Zionist demonstrations, in which spill into anti-Semitism. It feels as though it's harder and harder to even find common ground here, which is why I'm deeply appreciative of your time here. And I don't think tonight that I've said much of anything that you haven't heard before, and this is really for the benefit of our larger community here, and for Jews to hear you as well. I should put in that I offer huge thanks to the Upper Westchester Muslim Society and the Chapel Interfaith Council for sponsoring and bringing us together. And one thing we're going to talk about is perhaps there's a way to bring together some sort of discussion circles out of this to continue the conversation and just talk amongst some of these things and just get to know each other better. Because I think that part of the root cause of all of this distrust is that we don't see each other, we don't know each other. And that I do think, I think you would agree here, that for the average Palestinian, their interaction with an Israeli is with an IDF soldier who is interrogating them, who might be yelling at them, or doing worse, and that they do not have the benefit of having positive, trusting, vulnerable interactions with Israelis.
Yes and no. I will not be putting a general lens here to say every interaction of Palestinian is through the lens of an Israeli soldier manning checkpoint and harassing. Yes, there enough examples of that, and I went through that myself. And at the same time, it's not every Palestinian is someone who's coming to bomb your home or to throw rocks at you. No, actually, there are plenty of examples of economic trade that is happening between the two. What we look at this kind of example is, you know, Palestinians have been working in Israel for many, many years, been exploited. So probably the change in the treatment, how they're treated, will go along the way to building trust. So people have hired Palestinians inside of Israel, and Israelis have been inside the West Bank in other forms than being a settler and a soldier. And those are the healthy. However, they're overshadowed by the violence. And today, good luck calling for coexistence between the two, even in those inside of Israel, Arabs and Israelis, because the mob is more louder than the voice of reason. And that's is an unfortunate reality. So many people are silenced by what's happening. And no, I will not generalize to say Palestinian Christians and Muslims, their relationship with Israelis should be or has been always been through the prism of an Israeli soldier. No, I think there are plenty of better ways that they have been connecting. But as they say, if the news is bad, that's what makes news is bad news.
Right, and to your point that there's been so much bad news out of the region, and yet, you know, the week following the violence, there was protest after protest of Jews and Arabs together, saying that we will not be divided, and you know, we won't let this tear us apart, and see again Mansour Abbas and the Ram Party on the precipice of entering the government, and hopefully really bettering the lives of Israeli Arabs, which is so necessary. I would say one of the real formative moments of my Zionist perspective, I spent a week volunteering on a kibbutz in the country near Afula, near Migdal HaEmek, and I was put on a construction crew of Arab Israelis. And we paved roofs together, and we did all sorts of basic construction, and we became close. I remember sitting with them at lunch, and I grabbed my food and I started speaking to them, and they made it very clear that that's not the culture, that we eat quietly and that we speak afterwards. I was the loud American speaking to them. I became friends. Many of them came from the town of Kfar Aksel, and we spent time there together, and it really changed my perspective on the relationship between Jews and Arab potential in Israel, to see that there were so many very positive relationships. And you're right, this doesn't get spoken of enough. And I wonder what can be done about that. I want to talk about, as we said, to wrap up, what could be, how could, I don't think that in the moment that peace is possible, but I do think that there's things we've done to make things more peaceful. So one example, I'm going to go again to Michael Goodman's book, which I really would recommend, Advocate 67. He talks about that one of the ways that perhaps we could at least make life better is that within the West Bank currently, that there are all sorts of checkpoints, that if you go from one city if you want to go from Ramallah to Jenin, let's say in the West Bank, that you're going to encounter a checkpoint and you're going to encounter IDF soldiers, and that there would seem to be not much of any loss to Israeli security to be able to open up all of those routes so that the average person living in the West Bank would not encounter any soldier or anyone getting in their way or checking them in their daily lives. And that seems to me to be like one very simple step towards making life better. I want to know what you think of that, or do you have any other ideas around things we could get together on around just making life a little bit easier or less tense for others?
Well, again, I look at principles, Jonathan. The absence of violence does not mean that there is peace. or justice that is there. So whether I see Israeli soldiers or not, that's besides the point. Most of them have been rerouted outside of the general population areas and put on a system of infrastructure that is only for Israeli Jews, only on land, basically roads, bypass roads that move away from Palestinians. So they're there to protect the settlers, and for what the political worth of the settlers is to change conditions on the ground, which basically is what has been depriving the area of a viable Palestinian state in continuous in the West Bank and Gaza. It separated Palestinians geographically. It cuts the national expansion way before any of the violence, before even way before the first Intifada and the creation of Hamas. When you have, the West Bank ruled by Israeli soldiers, and they will limit the permits for building homes, and you're not allowed to build beyond the city limits, and all cities are surrounded by a ring of settlements. And when you build without a permit, your home would be demolished. So it's not the issue of whether I see Israeli soldier or not. It's what the Israeli soldier really stands for. It's what needs to be removed. The Israeli soldier stands for an occupation. The Israeli settler stands for a systematic land grab that needs to stop. So it's not the issue of whether I see them less tension or not. They need to be moved out. Settlements needs to be evacuated completely. Those who want to remain to live under Palestinian rule, let them live. The same way the Palestinians who remained and endured years of military occupation in Israel until the mid-60s, they lived and endured, and then they became Israeli citizens. So the core issues here, there is no way we can move around the core issues without addressing them. Keeping settlers who are colonialists in the West Bank and hoping for peace will not happen. So I have to choose between either continue with this colonialist project that demands more land and more resources and taking more water, or moving that completely out and offer a viable state that can live side by side.
I feel that we have to wrap up because we're supposed to. I think this time's out in 2 minutes. You got it. You dropped in 3 colonialists right there that I can't get to respond to, but that's okay. I think we'll earn it, and perhaps there's more to talk about going forward. But most of all, look, this is not easy, and I really appreciate this. To you, Kamal, to spending the time and to talk about this with me, with our community, to have a chance to put a human face to a terrible conflict and just to share your thoughts. I'm so appreciative. I'm so glad to have met you through the process, and we can talk about other ways to perhaps continue the conversation. But ultimately, my gratitude and thanks to you.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to be in dialogue with you, and you're absolutely right. It is once we start to put a human face, humanize the other, not dehumanize the other, that's when we might begin to feel the pain of others, might become compassionate, might become people of God who will not just feel the pain and try to correct injustice that's happening there. So our point today is to exchange some ideas. It might be painful, and it is painful sometimes to hear what's happening. And I did not look for agreement of what I said. All what I said is I hope that you will hear, and thank you so much for hearing me today. You asked me for recommendation of some books. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. 3 or 4 books that I recommend for people. Yeah, oh, look at you. There you go. Yeah.
Here's my favorites, but you guys go. And next time in New York, I hope you give me a call. Next time I'm in Berkeley, we can go to Zachary's Pizza and have some deep dish together, hopefully vegetarian, of course.
Oh, that's perfect. And I will take you to a Palestinian restaurants that you eat hummus, which is, by the way, Palestinian, not Israeli. Falafel is Palestinian, not Israeli. Mansaf is Palestinian, not Israeli. So you can enjoy our food, but by all means, don't take it and say it's yours.
You don't know, I used to live a block from Old Jerusalem Palestinian restaurant on Mission and 24th in San Francisco. The best hummus in all of San Francisco, yes. To be continued. Anyways, thank you so much. Have a good day over there. Good night over here. Thanks everyone for joining us. Kamal, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.